And without further ado, we move to the final part of this session, which will be the panel discussion. Two of the speakers I think I don't need to introduce because I already have, so Bertrand and Andrew. Two other speakers are Michael Arghyrou, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who is a graduate of the Economics department in the Athens University. He is currently the Prime Minister's economic advisor. He is also the head of the Council of Economic Advisors. He represents Greece at the Economic and Financial Committee, at the Eurogroup Working Group, at the Board of Directors of the European Stability Mechanism, also the Board of Directors of the European Investment Bank. He's one of the 5 members of the Steering Committee, which oversees and designed the Greek National Recovery Plan and Resilience Plan 2.0. And he's also a professor at the Economics Department in University of Piraeus and was a professor in Cardiff University and Brunel University. We also have Rana Sajedi, who is an economist in Bloomberg Economics in London. She was previously a researcher at the Bank of England. Her expertise is primarily the application of structural and macroeconomic models to global economic issues, with recent work on demographic change, long-run neutral interest rates, as well as international trade and supply chains. Her research appeared in leading academic journals, including also the IMF Economic Review. She's also a PhD from the European University Institute, which means we have a little alumni get-together here in the panel. So without further ado, I think I'd start with a very quick opener to each one of you, and maybe I'll start with the order of people who went up the stage. I mean, we had quite an intensive day today. This question might not be too fair to Michael, but 2-3 minutes, and what did you learn today? And Andrew, maybe you would be the first one.
I'm just struck that having spent 25 or 30 years reading from a macro point of view about an aging society and how it's going to be doom and gloom, I'm very struck by the IMF and the OECD both at the same time producing analysis that sort of says it's not as big as you think, both on the negative side. I think some of the GDP growths, if we don't adapt, I think Spain was the worst, and over 30 years the effects were pretty small compared to some of the past projections, and there were plenty of avenues for adjustment. So I think, of course that's what I've been pushing, but I think it's very striking to see the IMF and OECD at the same time coming up with this analysis and the range of policy levers. So I'm hoping that means we're going to start to see a more engaged policy debate.
Thanks a lot. Maybe now Rana?
Sure, thank you. So maybe it's a bit of an obvious thing to say, but I think what struck me from this session was really the role, like the focus on labor force participation and labor supply as the main channel through which we think about aging, both particularly in the analytical work, so both on the kind of what is the challenge? It's about declining labor force participation and declining labor supply. What is the opportunity? Is to bring some of these older generations back into the labor force, and it struck me how much space there is already from the age kind of 50. We think about this increased dependency of retirees, but actually already from age 50, there's this decline in labor supply that could be offset through some policies. But then thinking also to Domna's speech earlier, is also thinking about the social aspect of it and thinking about labor force participation as essentially a gateway into being more active and engaged in society more generally. And so I think thinking about it a bit more general than just the sort of L in our production function, but actually thinking about the input into society more generally and including into the kind of economy, but through other channels. So also thinking to Matthias's points about productivity, what are the channels through which we can think about particularly older cohorts also as inputs into kind of sources of ideas, innovation, and also providers of certain types of labor that maybe in this day and age can't be automated. So thinking about the neighborhood nannies that Domna mentioned, so the kind of labor that actually can't be automated away, and potentially older cohorts have some advantages or comparative advantages in. The last thing I would add as well is there's a sort of tacit theme of political economy throughout today's session. So thinking about David's comments earlier about the extent to which fiscal policy can ensure and provide intergenerational transfers, but also Andrew and John earlier talking about why it's difficult to embed prevention into our healthcare system, and there is a bit of a kind of theme of political economy, and I think also thinking about the older cohorts and the changing distribution and the kind of changing face of the demographic distribution of our populations as an input into the kind of voting and the decision-making in our society. I think these are kind of important things that are implicit in a lot of what we've talked about, but maybe bear more conversation as well.
Great, a lot of food for that. Michael, I know this is a bit unfair because you had to step out, but perhaps you want to share something with us anyway.
Sure. Thank you very much. So 3 points I think that came out of today's very interesting seminar. The first one is an optimistic message, the fact that health outcomes do improve. We, on average, are going to live longer. That is definitely a good thing. And the second thing is that these improved health outcomes create challenges in relation to economic outcomes. So with people living longer, under current policies, we face increasing risks of unsustainable imbalances in terms of fiscal pressures, lower growth in case we have missing labor force, falling living standards, and unsustainable social outcomes if these falling living standards go too far. The third thing, it's again positive, it is that these challenges can be addressed. There are ways to address these challenges through various channels. There is the possibility of improving fertility outcomes, but that on its own will not solve the aging population problem. It is possible, however, to increase labor supply by tapping untapped potential in a number of groups, including people at higher age, but also through increasing labor market participation in groups such as female labor participation or the participation of the young. In Greece, this is a very prominent policy question. And naturally, there is the question of achieving an increase in productivity of labor and capital, and in some cases, employing capital in order to make up for missing labor. So I think that this defines a crucial policy agenda, and I think that it is something which we cannot afford to ignore, but at the same time, not all is doom and gloom. There are ways to address the problems that we have discussed today.
Thanks a lot. It's always good to have an outright optimist in the panel. Bertrand.
Thanks. I think I would flag two aspects related to policies that go through the elements that were discussed today. First, it's clear that there's a need to increase labor supply and productivity of older workers and try to get them engaged in the labor market for as long as possible. But that requires lifelong policies. This is something that was stressed today. It's not an intervention that can be done when people reach old age. It's something that needs to be worked from the very early stages. That goes on the health pillar of human capital, on stressing health promotion and health prevention policies that currently receive less prominence that they would merit. That would allow workers to arrive fit to later age, but it also has to do with the perspective of training, reskilling and upskilling. It's a process that needs to be done along the life course. Second, the other aspect on policies that I think was touched upon today, and I think is crucial, is on the working for longer beyond the typical threshold that we have considered and we have in mind of 65, but that has to do not, again, with necessarily the statutory retirement age or minimum retirement age. Andrew was saying today, that did not lead to strong increases in participation. There was also evidence presented by the other papers. We need to think about the whole set of incentives, regulation, and rules that may prevent people from having longer careers. Today's presentation by David touched upon the retirement schemes, defined benefit versus defined contribution. One thing that I think has received less attention is to what extent the pension plans, and particularly the fragmentation of pension plans, may preclude workers from shifting activities along the life course that eventually ends up leading to earlier retirement than they would have liked to. It's, we think about labor misallocation as for the average worker, not considering age, but it's natural to think that people will want to do different things across the life course. And if they're living for longer, they would like to switch occupations, they would like to switch sectors, as if, for example, if the portability of pension rights is less than perfect, then they would think it twice. And then eventually they will end up leaving the labor force earlier than they would have liked to, earlier than they are fit for, just because the incentives are not there. And related, the age friendliness of works, it's a dimension that needs to evolve in order to foster the participation of people later into life.
Perfect, thanks a lot. I have a whole set of questions of my own, but the objective of this is to let you ask questions. So the only thing I'd like to ask you, when you ask a question, please, well, actually two things. One, please identify yourself, and the second one, if you could specify whether the question is to anyone specifically in the panel, or whether it's a more general question, or others. Yeah. So floor is open. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, two quick questions. One for Michael in your role as policymaker. One thing about, so it sounds like we have an idea of what the right policies are. I'm struck by the fact that many of these policies may not be very popular. And it's sort of related to the second question, which is maybe more direct to Andrew, but I think everybody, I'm sure, have their views. A lot of the headlines that you read in the press is actually people wanted to work less, not more. Maybe it's transitory, maybe it was driven by COVID, and we discovered that flexible work and leisure is nice. But it sounds like a lot of the news are actually going in the opposite direction. So how do we deal with this?
Yeah, sorry, Michael, go ahead. I think it's easier this way.
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head there. I think that we all have a fairly clear idea as to what the right policies are to address the adverse effects of demographic developments. But you're absolutely right in saying that this raises political challenges. And the reason is that in order to address the effects of demographic developments, you need to take action that affect change. And it is in the human nature to be suspicious of change. So here you have, for example, I have already some notes here. You have to, as it came out from today's discussions, increase the minimum retirement age along with life expectancy. That is something that has been happening, but it is not an easy process. In certain countries, it has caused very deep political troubles. Also, when you want to increase the labor market participation, you need to tilt the cost and benefits of participating versus an activity in favor of participating. And this implies that you make certain decisions that may have some negative repercussions for certain beneficiaries. Now, I think that the main problem is that when you do such changes, you have direct, measurable, and immediate costs, whereas the benefits spread into the future, they are less well defined and they are less easily understood. The Greek experience, and I think that the experience from other countries, shows the following, that the cost of inactivity eventually tends to be higher. So one policy implication from previous experience, including the Greek one, is that despite the difficulty of taking such action, it is better to take such action at a constant and manageable manner rather than leaving things to accumulate in big imbalances where you have to go in and do things that are extremely challenging socially wise. So given that, then you need to be able to manage this kind of gradual change in a way that it is accepted. So clearly incentivizing the outcomes that you want is a good idea. Making sure that you have effective safety nets for the losers of reforms that are involved in demographic policy decisions is another obvious requirement for the policy to be accepted. And the last thing, which is a common theme in many policy discussions, is to communicate in ways that people who are not specialized in economics can understand the reasons as to why you take this action, so that there is a sense of fairness on the one hand, and on the other hand, of a plan that is well thought and aims to deliver. So I think that these three things, positive incentives, safety nets, and good convincing communication are important in order to do these things, which are by no means easy. But the Greek experience has shown that even in the most adverse economic and social circumstances, significant progress can be made, but you don't need to reach really that level of imbalances before you take the action that you need to take, because you pay an unnecessary cost.
Thanks a lot. Anybody else?
Yeah, if I can just jump in. The other thing that struck me today, and I was at a conference with mainly health people the other week, is that the health people see this as all about you've got to be healthy, and they tell people to exercise more and eat less, drink less, smoke less, sleep more. And people don't get very excited about that. I'm sort of mindful of that famous study that said that if you look at the amount of exercise you have to do, it takes more time to do the exercise relative to the extra life you get. So if you don't actually enjoy the exercise, there's no point in doing it. And then here we are in an economic conference, say, good news, you're going to work for longer. That solves a problem. And again, it's kind of not a great way of capturing people's imagination, which is why I think having Domna here was just very interesting, because this is about life and what we do with it and how we go about redesigning life. And I think that's part of the challenge here. I think your point about people not wanting to work more goes without saying, that's right. Although they are actually working more. And that's not about the state pension age. More people aged over 50 are working. And some of that's to do with educational trends, and some of that's to do with choice. So it's beginning to happen. I just think, and I know we're going to talk about this tomorrow with institutions, and I'll steal David Canning's point, which is that governments are trying to get people to do things they don't want to do to preserve social security institutions, which is completely the wrong way around. We should be adapting our institutions to support what people want to do. And I think some of that is about making work easier, so that's about age-friendly work. It's about flexible hours. And I think what we did in the 20th century was take lots of leisure after retirement. And I think the trick in the 21st century is to take more leisure this side of retirement. We start work later, we do more part-time work, we might take time out. And that seems to be more of a social contract, which taps into fairness and says to people, I'm going to make life more interesting and easier for you, but you're going to have to work for longer too. That seems a very different social contract than just saying, guess what, you're going to have to work for longer, which is grossly unfair given inequalities in health that we see. And just saying people, you've got to go on. I always call it Samuel Beckett economics. Samuel Beckett says, I can't go on, I must go on, I will go on. And that kind of seems to be our attitude towards the state pension age at the moment. And that can't be socially popular.
Thanks a lot. Anybody else? No? Any more questions? Okay. Do you have the mic? Yep.
Hello, thank you very much. Very interesting panels we've had and conversations. My name is Paul Kidner. I work for philanthropy here in Greece. It's called TIMA, for the elderly. And it struck me throughout the conversations that we had that a lot of these are based on future changes. So it's like one of the presenters said, you know, it has to do with fertility. If you change something now, it's going to affect everything in 20 years. And I feel that this is where we are now with policy, with much of the policy discussions. But on the ground, there are, and Mr. Ferreira mentioned it earlier, he said, you know, I think we're going to see a lot of people on the streets. We're already seeing people on the streets. And these are elderly people, and it's horrifying. And this is growing. And I wonder if you have a view on this, and if there is something that we can be doing now to help and support this side of the short-term side of the effects that our previous policies have had.
Thanks a lot. Anybody want to pick that one up? Don't be shy.
I mean, let me start by saying that, of course, policies to change the effect of aging are necessarily things that will pay off over decades, and that's by nature. I mean, we stressed the fact that most of the interventions that are needed are lifelong interventions, but that doesn't mean that many of the policy tools don't have effects also on the short run. I mean, trying to boost labor force participation on workers that may be disincentivized and maybe dropping early, not necessarily for health-related issues, but for other reasons, in the 50 to 65-year bucket would pay off relatively quick. So there's some of these policies that may have effects earlier on. You know, narrowing the male labor force participation gap, it's something that can have effects on the relatively near term. Some of those interventions do have costs, and they need to be assessed how to implement it. Some face resistance, and they need to be communicated well. They need to be explained clearly why the interventions are taken. And then there's another dimension that we saw that aging is a global phenomenon, but it's hitting at different times. There are countries that are still at a very early stage, and they should be starting intervening on these dimensions. Now, I mean, think about emerging markets, but even low-income countries. They need to start putting together their structures to ensure that they get the dividends from demographics while they have it, before they get into terms of a drag from demographics, and they're as better prepared as possible when they hit that point. So, action is inevitable. Some have short-term gains. Not all policy interventions, but that doesn't mean that there's no need to act as soon as possible.
Thanks a lot. And I'm really grateful that you guys are giving short answers. Yeah. Anybody else want to? All right.
Yeah. Sorry. So, I mean, to kind of go back to what are some of the policies that we can think about addressing the problems of the elderly, not so much in my kind of professional capacity, but just anecdotally from, my own life and what I see. I think care and caring is a big part of the conversation that maybe hasn't come up today. So maybe one of the things that, right now with the elderly population that we have, the health, of that elderly population that we have, one of the things that's created is a need for provision of care, and a lack of that being done by sort of by the government and by public sector, and a lot of that falling on private unpaid care. I mean, it sort of indirectly speaks to some of the themes of labour force participation that we've spoken about, because it does take those people out of work earlier than they would otherwise in order to care for elderly kind of relatives or friends. But that's also, I think, something that maybe there's a role for policy to step in and think about actually providing that care and providing the infrastructure for those carers to continue working, for example, and things like that. I think that's something that's more immediate than these longer run policies.
Yeah, I do think that care and caring is huge, both as a welfare issue, both as an impact on both people's health, the carer and the person being cared for, and it also has labour supply issues. But I want to sort of pick up on a more general point. I think, you know, the sort of standard macro way of looking at an aging society is everyone over 65 is the same and has the same problem. And then you have very rich policies for people under 65 based on all sorts of issues. And the more we see an aging population, the more we recognize that aging is just incredibly heterogeneous. And so therefore, all the things that bother us under 65, guess what? They're manifest after 65. So based on gender, based on income, based on education, based on ethnicity, there are enormous differences. Everyone doesn't age the same. And I think that's going to be one of the bigger challenges. How do we move away from a pretty simple reliance upon chronological age to say, I need to target things more in a way that is fair? And I think that's going to be a really big challenge. I'm struck by the absurdity in the UK. I said I turned 60 recently. I now get free travel on the underground buses and trains within London because I've turned 60. It's just ludicrous that that's sort of happening. So how do we shift some of this to make sure that we have the right safety nets and the right proposals? And you know, we did design some sense of financial security in the 20th century, which was pretty widespread and worked rather well, and now that seems to be being frayed. So I do think we've got to revisit it. And you know, one of the challenges with a longer life is you've got more time for shocks to happen. So how do you prepare against that? But also you've got two possibilities, one of which is that where you start from has less of an impact over your life because you've got more time to recover. And the other is actually inequalities compound over time and you get growing inequality. And it looks to me more like the latter at the moment in most societies. That's a real problem. It's a real problem.
So Andrew's one of these people that complain about the benefits they get. But Michael, you wanted to add something? Or?
Yes, I think that everything that has already been said has added value to answering your question. Probably I should concentrate on the very short run, because in the medium and in the long run, definitely, you can do things that can develop resources in order to be able to address the kind of poverty at older age, but also younger age. You can have a growing economy. Naturally, it's a prerequisite in order to create the economic resources to address this kind of problems. But in the immediate short run, these extra resources are unlikely to be available because they have not been created, in which case I think that there is a good case of examining the efficiency of our policies. So all of us are spending money in order to support vulnerable groups of the population. The question is, do we spend them in the way that maximizes their impact? So I think this is an area where we can learn a lot by examining the data and adopt a data-driven approach. If we identify that the way we support our vulnerable groups can be improved, then we should do so. We can reallocate resources from one use to another use. And clearly, the most vulnerable should have a priority there.
Just to say there, sorry to intervene again, but we've done a research paper with the LSE on the help at home, and there are huge efficiencies that can be created there, and I'd be happy to share that with you because we think that that is a real area of improvement.
Thanks a lot. I think Matthias, you had a question?
Okay. Yeah, I just have a quick follow-up question, actually, for Bertrand on this talk, if I may. So I found it very interesting that you showed sort of evidence for healthy aging by showing cohort differences in various dimensions of aging. I was just wondering, is it possible that maybe you're even underestimating the trends in healthy aging across cohorts? Because if I understood your exercise correctly, you were controlling for important socioeconomic characteristics like education, for example. But in many ways, you know, those socioeconomic characteristics are precisely what can differ across cohorts in important ways, and I'm not sure that it's necessary to sort of partial out or control for these effects. But maybe there is a good reason for doing that. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
So we are controlling for a battery of socioeconomic characteristics, and controlling for those, we find that just the cohort in which you are born, as cohorts advance, the health indicator improves. So holding fixed the socioeconomic characteristics. But we're not going into the drivers of what explain that improvement of health indicators over time. A lot is related with changing behaviors that are conditions for the development of diseases and chronic diseases over time. But we didn't get into drivers of healthy aging. Now, to the extent that those characteristics are controlled, the residual effect is on a time trend, on the cohort effect. Then, there's a lot of variability in which indicator we look at, but the evidence is quite significant. The cohort effect is there, regardless of the health metric.
Perfect. Any more questions, please?
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you. My name is Manos Kastrinakis. I think I was going to say that I'm the only one from an NGO of civil society here, but I'm glad to hear the man from TIMA, who is probably the only organization funding activities that have to do with the third age, older people. And I'm saying the older that because it's a shame that CSR organizations all over Greece do not touch anything that has to do with this particular issue. I'm glad to see that there is a serious organization that has established in Greece and this conference, and I'm very glad to have been here, which I was informed by my friend Bertrand. And I have some questions which I will reserve for tomorrow because I think it's a more appropriate panel tomorrow. But I would like to know, how am I going to tell the 60 people that I have, of which I'm working to establish a new NGO in the area of longevity? What am I going to say to the 8,000 people in Thessaloniki that we're cooperating, which are interested to cohabitate? They're over 65. And they're looking for buildings that they're all over the place, either by the church or by the public sector, and they're sitting unused. What am I going to tell them? That I came here and I heard a lot of discussions, basically academics talking to academics, and how am I going to say that what I heard, it's the future, it's the useful for them, it's what has to come, and how we're going to meet the challenge as people who are in our 80s to educate the whole other generations. This young photographer here, I wish I knew what she thinks about all those things, what she thinks about what is coming or will come, how is she going to prepare herself for it. So this is the challenge, and that challenge comes from the books that Andrew Scott has written, and we are taking them on as a challenge. This is, I do not want anybody to particular, but if you can give me some answers, you will help me to tell those people what I heard and what is coming. Thank you.
Any takers for that one? Please.
All I can say is a good question. I'm not sure I've got good answers, but let me try and explain what I think about things. I think one of the challenges about this topic of longevity, it covers every aspect of life. And everyone's going to have their own different issue that's really important. And when you get together a bunch of macroeconomists, they're going to focus on one thing that's going to be very far removed from what people are interested in. And so everyone is going to be having to experiment here, because the simple point is that we are talking overall this day and a half about how do we change our institutions, our policies, our behaviors, and our norms to adapt to something we haven't had to do before. And so we haven't got the right answers. I think we've got to experiment and find out. We've got to look around the world and find out who's doing things and quickly borrow what's right, but we need people like you to experiment. And it's as simple as that. I think also you probably don't want the government to come up with a solution as to what you should do. I think it's really important to hear what people want to do. Totally. Yeah, so if you think about how change happens, the trouble we're in this space that is, what the sociologists would call under-institutionalized. And everyone's trying to sort of make things work in a space where the institutions are set up for a different lifespan, different type of work, and different type of jobs. That's why we've got the health and pensions crisis, and why so many ministries of finances are trying to get people to change to stabilize the institutions, but we have to change the institutions. So that then comes down to a theory of change, and of course the theory of change is brought about partly by policies and institutions, and in some things they will lead, but often they lag. Then you've got individuals, and it's really hard for individuals to bring about change on their own. There will be NGOs that will speak for or initiate things, and there will also be the private sector and companies. And companies are particularly important. They're kind of the distribution arm of social change, but I don't think governments are the distribution arm of social change. So I think it's also a question of how we hear the voice of people, because I think the great danger is we get a prevention health system that doesn't really appeal to people because it's not what they want in terms of how to live their lives. We get changes in the state pension age that don't really appeal to people because it's not how they want to run their life. And if you look at the sort of the big challenges, the changes that happened in the 20th century, we invented teenagers, we invented the midlife crisis, we invented retirement, and that was brought about by a whole mix of social change and government change and corporate change. I think we're in the same process. We're just at a very early stage of it. And in many ways, people are much further advanced than governments and certainly corporations, who I think in general are lagging way behind in this. So it's not a good answer, but perhaps it explains the sort of everyone's groping around in the dark, but then you have an urgent issue. This is people now wanting to do something.
If I may add to that, actually, maybe somebody else wants to answer, because I was thinking about, the whole thing about change. Yes, I mean, that's necessary, but how, taking the political economy of this change, right? I mean, a lot of emphasis on prevention, right? And I think John Bell mentioned that, a lot of the prevention, you need 20 years or something to get the effect of, right? But in a democracy with the population being increasingly old and for many of them being too late for this prevention, how do you convince politicians to put more weight on prevention? And also more and more of them don't have kids, right? So how do you convince them to spend more on prevention rather than cure, right? And then I don't know if anybody else wants to react to that. Or maybe not, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I agree. These are not easy answers. There are no easy answers to these questions. I think that, well, going back to what you mentioned, obviously there is a lot of heterogeneity in the challenges individuals face. We speak about welfare here and the ability of policy to promote welfare and at the same time giving the opportunity to individuals to raise their welfare themselves. These are two things that are not common to everybody at the same time. It's one thing having time to get, for example, reskilling, being able to develop opportunities for yourself, and it's another thing when you are at a much higher age, in which case that is not so feasible. But the fact that there is such heterogeneity does not mean that policy should not be trying in order to improve the average, especially for new generations. So it is never too late, I think, in order to initiate policies and measures which bring the desired results, and at the same time adopt a pragmatic approach for those parts of the population that the margin for self-improvement is not very high. But that doesn't mean that policy has no relevance. At some point you have to start. If things, as we were discussing today, are not sustainable given present policies, you have to start changing the policies in order for things to be sustainable down the road, and try to manage the situation for those people who cannot benefit from the changed policies. And unavoidably, you will have to prioritize. Unavoidably, you have trade-offs. These are not easy things. But I think that all of us, at the end of the day, as social scientists, have some kind of understanding of what is a minimum of support that you have to give to people that cannot support themselves, and give it to them. Again, it is not a perfect answer, but that's how I think about it.
Thank you. And
Can I just pick up on your prevention point? First of all, what a horrible name, isn't it, prevention? And it kind of just shows how disease-focused our health system is. That we call staying healthy prevention is just the weirdest thing in the world. Secondly, I think that the health system will tell you, oh, worry about your blood sugar, worry about your blood pressure. I don't think most people actually do worry about that. They want some connection with health. And then if you look at what's happening with the GLP-1 drugs, there's massive popular demand for these drugs. And I don't think it's because of the health properties. I think it's because people want to look good. So, perhaps it's just something to do with the messaging or the marketing, but I think you can get people interested in prevention. You just got to actually tap into what it is they're interested in. And I think that goes back to the sort of theory of social change. How much of it is led by society and how much of it is led by policy?
All right, so my mother is much more into prevention than me, probably, so probably there is something to it. We are kind of getting to the really last moments, but before we end, I think I'd take the privilege of the chair to ask you one sentence response question. It's like, this is a CEPR RPN event, so if you were to name one research priority area which you think, that there should be, or you would like the answers to, in a very short kind of manner, I'd be grateful. We can start maybe from Rana.
Sure. So I think it's been implicitly mentioned before, but I think really thinking about how the labor market will change and the kind of future of work, thinking, of course, about AI and these types of changes, but also the sort of sectoral reallocations that we might see, and not just thinking about those as potentially offsetting the impact of aging, but the actual interaction with aging. So what does the labor market look like when the age distribution has shifted as much as we have seen and expect to see, and how does AI kind of impact the labor market when you have a predominantly young workforce versus when you have a predominantly older workforce, and kind of thinking back to Andrew's point earlier on about Malthus and the sort of not really anticipating where future productivity growth and future economic growth is going to come from, and what is it that we are potentially not seeing just by thinking about focusing on labor supply issues around aging, but actually where does productivity, the next wave of productivity, come from in an aging society?
Sounds like a good candidate for a Holy Grail. Bertrand, maybe?
Thanks. I think that one area that would be great to look more is the interaction of technology and aging. Matthias alluded to the uncertainty and what conflicting messages we have there in the literature, and it has a lot of dimensions, from the role of aging on innovation, the role of aging on aging society, like larger share of older cohorts in the economy, on technology adoption and diffusion, But also, there's a role of technology for helping with healthy aging itself. John mentioned today the role that AI can have on early diagnostic and on prevention. It probably can also have a big role on retraining along life and helping people retrain as having your perfect assistant to help you adapt to new technologies as you grow old. So the interaction technology and aging, I think it's a big area for the future.
Yeah, okay, well, that's two on a similar issue. Michael?
These are great topics, of course. I would say a couple of things. The first relates to the first question we received. As a policymaker, mainly, I would be very interested in knowing more about the policy strategies that can introduce necessary changes in the most consensual manner. That is one thing that would be very, very useful. And putting on my academic hat, perhaps this is something that literature exists and I'm not familiar with it. We have discussed today a lot about the impact of health on labor, but is it likely that there is a reverse causality as well? Is it likely that there is a link between your decision to participate in the labor market on your physical and mental health? That is another thing that I would be very interested in knowing more about.
Perfect. Andrew, quick one.
Prioritizing research is never something I'm very good at. I just try and do it all at the same time, so this is a terribly difficult question. And there's loads of work about everything in economics. I would say in general, you know, we're going about demographic pyramids that were this shape and going to this shape. And I would say our body of economic knowledge is that shaped and not that shaped. We're just underrepresented in understanding what happens at older ages, the motivation of older people, and even the classic life cycle hypothesis in economics. You know, there's nothing really interesting going on in that stage 3. You just run down your assets. There's never really been an employment decision, a health decision, so it's just been understudied. It's changing a bit with all the data sets of people from 50 onwards, but we know that old people don't suddenly occur at age 50 or age 60. There's a whole lifetime trajectory. So I think there's a load of work to be done, but where I would focus on is not dissimilar to what's been mentioned. As a macroeconomist, I'd focus on 50 to 65 years of age and think, actually, I think that's a key platform for people's future health and future finances. How does health, skills, and engagement affect employment, and how does employment affect their health as well? I think that's a huge double-way impact, and I think that would be the most obvious policy lever to pull on as well.
Perfect. So with that, I think I would love to thank all the panelists for a very interesting discussion.